Welcome to a graphic art German Expressionist prints from the McNay Art Museum and the Bronston Collection. The McNay Art Museum is in San Antonio. They're about the size of the Crocker Art Museum, and they have a wonderful collection of Expressionist prints and of course other prints as well. The Bronston Collection is a local Sacramento collection, and which has been kind enough to lend to us to supplement the exhibition. The period that we're talking about is the period in the early 1900s. So the earliest print in the exhibition is from 1898, and the latest from 1946. There are several things to keep in mind when talking about German Expressionism. First of all, we're not talking only about Germany, but also about Austria and other German-speaking lands. As you know, the city of Prague also had a large German-speaking contingent for many years, for example. The period covers several events that are also things to keep in mind. First of all, the First World War. The history that we've been given is very different from the history of the war in German-speaking lands, at least in terms of the aftermath, which was very different in Germany and Austria. After the First World War, the loss of that war and the economic changes forced by that loss also led to societal changes in government, all sorts of things. And so it's some of the sort of uncertainty surrounding the world of the First World War in German-speaking lands. That's something that we need to keep in mind. As we go through the exhibition, you'll notice things also about technique. The German Expressionists used woodcut in very interesting ways, and in ways in which woodcut had not been used really almost for centuries. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, is technique. So let's begin talking about the objects in the exhibition. This image encapsulates many of the things about German Expressionism in the exhibition. It's a woodcut, and as I've said, German Expressionists revitalized woodcut. Woodcut had been out of fashion in the 19th century, partly because so much of printmaking, at least in the early 19th century, was reproductive. And the effects of woodcut are not really all that well suited to reproducing, say, a work of art. The way that Haeckel, this is Erich Haeckel, uses woodcut is interesting in that he has these sort of big areas of black that sort of dominate the image. The black of his shoulders and clothing, the black of his hair, and then as you move into the image, the black of the eyebrows and some of the features comes through very well. You'll notice also a bit of distortion in regards to anatomy. The artist, this is Haeckel's self-portrait, the artist elongates the features. He creates these sort of jagged contours for his own head and for the contours of the face, the cheeks, even the hands. The hands are folded, and we don't know whether that's in prayer or whether it's through anxiety. We don't know. But one of the most striking things about this portrait, this self-portrait, of course, is the use of color. It's unnatural color. The background is not defined for us, actually, very well. It's given in two different shades, one sort of a purplish blue, one a sort of orangish yellow. And then, of course, the artist's own features are in this sort of sickly green. The date of this print is 1919. And if you think about when that is, this is after the First World War, just after it, within the year of when it ended. And there is so much change that's happening politically, socially, economically in German-speaking lands. And one hesitates to read too much into it, but this sort of self-portrait, this man sort of with hands folded, it's as if he's looking almost into an uncertain future himself. One of the things that German Expressionist artists were really interested in is different and new uses of techniques. So they actually invented the linocut, using linoleum instead of wood as the matrix. Here, the matrix is, of course, still wood. The image is by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, and he belonged to a group of artists called Die Brücke, which means the bridge, and they were wanting to build a bridge from the art of the past to the art of the future. One of the things about this image that you'll notice is the sort of almost jagged quality of the contours for what is, after all, two very furry creatures. And so the cats are sort of shown looking at us in this sort of unsettling way, but their forms are defined with many sort of straight lines, with many sort of angles, and it's sort of an unusual use of the medium. One of the influences for the German Expressionists was the early history of woodcut. They were looking back at the early woodcuts of the 1400s and 1500s, which were actually, in a lot of ways, rather crude. They were often religious images that were sort of represented a saint or the Madonna and Child, and they were actually, there were a lot of them made, and they were actually relatively common images. So they're taking some of that sort of crude quality and applying it to their imagery. And another thing that Schmidt-Rottluff does here is actually sort of unusual. With woodcut, there's actually a lot of physical effort that happens because everything that prints is black. So there's a lot of wood that has to be cut away to create those black lines. Now, he's done that with the images of the cats and what must be a table. Expressionist artists, and especially Schmidt-Rottluff, like to play with things like perspective. But if you notice over here, what he's done is to take the paper and then print the areas that have been cut away. So you're seeing the chisel marks from where he made the image, the part that's been cut away. So Schmidt-Rottluff was a friend of Ernst Kirchner, and so who was also, of course, a member of Die Brücke. So this is one of those sort of sub-movements that's useful to keep in mind. Ernst Kirchner was a friend of Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, who's also represented in the exhibition, a fellow member of Die Brücke, the bridge movement. This print is actually sort of difficult to read in some ways. You have these areas of black on either side, and then boats, a passing ship, but you're not sure exactly where everything is. The paper that he uses is a yellow, which is, of course, an unnatural color. That's something that German expressionist artists often do, is sort of play with a natural color. But this, as you sort of look more closely, you start to be able to identify things like these sort of flashes of white, which represent the trunks of trees. And then also you start to realize that we're looking down even on the trees. Now, the title of this print actually gives us a clue. It is Blankenese, which is actually a neighborhood in Hamburg. And that neighborhood is at the top of a hill. And so we're sort of looking into the Elbe River, which flows past from above. And then we can then sort of understand exactly what's happening here. So perspective, all of these things are really sort of very unusual in the hands of artists like Ernst Kirchner. And of course, Kirchner went on from this date, 1910, he went on to become a painter of social life as well. And so there are images in the exhibition of Kirchner's friends as well from his early period. And as I've said, he will then go on to later paintings of sort of social criticism. German Expressionism was multi-centered, not only in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Dresden, but also in Munich. There were artists who were working in an Expressionist style. This print by Franz Marc is a story of creation. It was actually meant for an illustrated Bible. Marc was a member, and in some ways the founder, of a group called Der Blaue Reiter, so the Blue Rider, which actually is the title of one of Marc's paintings. There are several artists in that movement. One of the things about these prints, especially by these artists, is that there's a certain amount of work expected of the viewer. As we look at this story of one of the first days of creation, it's difficult to decipher exactly what's happening. I, at least, first notice this creature with the tail, perhaps a kind of monkey, and then only later do I look above and see in negative, if white on black rather than black on white, this bird who looks ready to fly out of the picture plane. And then down here, a claw sort of points to this being a creature, whether that's a beaver, a bear, we don't really know. And so, as I've said, deciphering some of the images before you and some of these images that represent sort of simultaneous views of things is expected of the viewer. Now, Marc's style in this print is not that sort of jagged style that we saw with Schmidt-Rottluff or even Kirchner. It's rather different. So he's sort of playing with different forms here, circles, ovals, all of these things that are sort of representing living creatures. Emil Nolde is one of the artists who doesn't actually fit into any of the sort of movements that one thinks of when one thinks of German Expressionism. He was a fantastically talented printmaker. Born in Schleswig, which is on the border between Germany and Denmark, he came from a Danish family. And he actually grew up near the sea and was very interested in the life of the sea and the people of the sea. In 1910, in February and March, he spent those months in Hamburg, of course, an extremely important port city in northern Germany. And in that time, he made over 100 drawings, 19 etchings, including these images here, and that trip sort of created, was the material for many other works as well. One of the things about this exhibition is it's also important to pay attention to etching technique or lithography technique. Here we have etching, and we have not only the standard etched plate, and of course with etching you take a copper plate, you cover it with a hardish ground with wax in it, you scratch through that ground, and then the exposed copper is then etched. The lines are sort of dug into the plate by acid. That's the sort of basis of the medium. But there's another part of that etching process that's very interesting, where once the copper plate is bare, you can take a needle and dig into it, and the bits of metal thrown up at either side of the groove will print as a wonderful, wonderful furry, deep black. And we see that here in this image of a pier. The pilings, for example, all of those are done with dry point. And then this sort of stippled effect has to do also with method as well, in which the acid from the acid bath is actually sort of splattered across the plate to give this effect. Here, there is a sort of wealth of dry point, an open bite, which is what it's called when you use the acid, apply the acid directly to the plate, etching, all of these things for this depiction of a distant steamer that's almost sort of swallowed up by the waves of a rough sea. The only way that we actually know what this image is really is the plume of smoke that sort of departs from this smokestack that's sticking up. And so there's one of the things that he does is the contrast of white and black with the sort of crests of the waves in this sort of reserve of unetched areas of the plate. So Nolde is known for paintings, he's known for religious subjects, he's known for all sorts of different images. But this period in Hamburg was, in many ways, one of his most productive as regards etching. Both of these images are published images. They appeared in a journal called Kriegszeit, which is war times, essentially. And the purpose of that publication was for artists to sort of have a forum to express their ideas about the war. This image at the top is called Der Heilige Krieg, so the Holy War. And he uses, this is Ernst Barlach, uses some of the sort of drama of form as a vehicle for emotion that we've seen in the work of other artists as well. So the Holy War, with this figure sort of striding towards us in the garb almost of a prophet, with this stern but also almost fearful expression, I think, on his face as he wields this sort of machete as he goes towards the enemy. Barlach is an interesting artist in that, yes, these two images have to do with, these are sort of images that reflect a certain patriotism. This one, for example, with the figure with a flail, has to do with a battle in which the Germans defeated the Russians in eastern Poland, and the flail is supposed to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, and the chaff being, of course, the Russian armies. Barlach served in the First World War, as did many of the artists in this exhibition, and he returned a pacifist, again, as many of the artists did. He went on to create memorials to the German war dead, and used the style of Expressionism also in his sculpture to sort of convey the deep emotions that such a tragic war sort of evoked among artists, among the public as well. So German-speaking lands, of course, as I've said, include Austria, and this artist is Austrian, Oskar Kokoschka. And by now, you'll be familiar with the sort of frenzied style that Kokoschka uses in this portrait of a young woman. Thanks to an interview with him and his wife from many years later, we know who she is. Her name is Corona Stevens, and she is one of several friends that Kokoschka made after the war. He considered the war to be such a tragedy brought on by essentially male ego that he sort of focused on, yes, platonic friendships with women after the war, to sort of, he was turning his back on things that sort of led to such a tragedy. This image is also interesting for its color. It's one of a few that was done in this sort of reddish orange ink. The German Expressionist artists knew their art history. I've mentioned when I was talking about woodcut, they were sort of looking at woodcuts from the 15th, 16th centuries. Here, this artist is looking at a different aspect of 16th century art. Around the time of Dürer, artists like Ludwig Krug, and we don't know exactly why they did this, they would often print their plates in a sort of reddish-orange ink to give a different effect. So Kokoschka is looking back at art history as well. The world of the 1920s in Germany is a world of drastic changes. So there are social changes, there are political changes, there are economic changes, some of them rather tragic in a lot of ways. But it's also a period of great creativity. Max Beckmann, and this is a self-portrait by him, is one of the artists who sort of, as the 1920s came in, started to sort of turn away from a certain kind of what he regarded and his friends regarded as sort of overwrought emotionalism of some of the artists that we've talked about in earlier Expressionism. And in fact, there's a name for the Beckmann and his friends and what their view of art called Die neue Sachlichkeit, so the new objectivity. So they're looking at the world around them and representing it in what they consider to be an objective manner. So here is Beckmann himself, and he's wearing a bowler hat and a winged collar. And this is the uniform, essentially, of the office worker in Germany and certainly Berlin at the time. He is sort of staring out at us, and there's a certain, with all of this change that I'm talking about, social, etc., there is a certain kind of alienation that ends up happening. And at least I think that his gaze at the viewer is one with this sort of stern but uncertain look, expresses some of that alienation that was sort of coursing through German society at the time. The image is also extremely important in terms of technique. It is entirely done in dry point, and that is that technique in which a needle is used to scrape a bare copper plate to create these sort of nice, fuzzy, dark, black areas, which he uses to create all of the fabric of the bowler hat, but also the action of light on it. And he's not alone, actually. He has his ashtray at the ready. This is the globe of a lamp. And he has a cat for companionship, so perhaps the alienation is not absolute. The artists of Die Neue Sachlichkeit, or the New Objectivity, turned a critical eye on German society and the changes that were happening in it. In this watercolor by Georg Gross, we have simply an encounter on a street, and likely, of course, a Berlin street. We have this central figure who's a sort of prosperous-looking, portly businessman who is passing what looks to be rather a hard-nosed young woman with a shabby fur. And, of course, Gross doesn't hesitate to show us her form beneath her dress. And then over here we have a sort of strange figure who's passing in his trench coat, smoking a cigarette. And he, at least to me, sort of embodies the alienation of urban German society at the time. He's shown almost as a skull with a sort of very gaunt face with a gray coloring, and then these eyes behind very thick glasses that magnify the pupils. And so I've said that the New Objectivity, these artists were looking at what they considered to be the sort of objective reality around them. However, that objectivity doesn't extend to things like technique, proportion, all of those things. If you think about this image, the businessman is actually about 1.5 times as big as the woman. And then this unnatural color in the face of this man, and a distorted face at that. Then, of course, there are other unnatural colors in this undefined background. So, new objectivity in regards to content, but not always in regards to technique. I've mentioned social criticism in the work of Georg Gross. There's one artist whose work really is all about social criticism, and that is Käthe Kollwitz. Her work, in many ways, precedes the work of the artists that we commonly think of as expressionists. She was turning her critical eye on German society as early as the late 1880s and 90s. Kollwitz did several print series, and one of them, several of them actually use historical events to comment on present reality, or what was then present reality. The series from which this print is taken is about the farmers' revolt in around 1525 in southern Germany. What happened was the conditions for those who worked the land were so intolerable that they rebelled against the landowners, so the aristocracy. That event was really the greatest uprising of workers before the French Revolution in German society, or at least that is the common view. In this image, we see a farmer's wife who is sharpening. The image is called beim Dengeln, so sharpening, and she's sharpening a scythe. So we see the wooden handle of the scythe, its blade here, the woman's hand with the whetstone, and then her eyes narrowed as she checks the edge. Aside from the very interesting technique and the sort of in which she sort of achieves all the sort of differences in texture and shading in a very dark space, this image also comments on the desperation of these workers, because the only weapons they had were the weapons with which they worked the land, so pitchforks, scythes, etc. So this very powerful image it relates to the sort of politics of workers in German society in Kollwitz's time. Now, Kollwitz actually precedes, as I've said, the German Expressionists in some ways. Her themes, of course, were taken up by some of them. But she also, her career sort of went past the work of many German Expressionists. On the other end, she lived all the way until 1945. This is an extremely powerful image and one of Käthe Kollwitz's most famous. The title, the word across the bottom, is simply bread, Brot, and it relates to the choices, the very painful choices that people in extreme poverty have to make. The date of the print is 1924, and just the year before, Germany went through a period of hyperinflation in which so much money was printed that if you were paid on Friday, you needed to do your shopping on Friday because by Monday, your money would be worth less. By November of 1923, in fact, you had to have nearly 1 trillion marks or over 1 trillion marks to simply buy a loaf of bread. This image shows some of the consequences of that kind of economy out of control. The mother here is denying food to her daughter, while behind her back she stuffs bread into the face of her son. So, as you can imagine, this image with its power was easily adapted and without credit by political actors. So it was used by political parties on the left, and later it was actually used by the National Socialist Party, which enraged Kollwitz because she did not in any way adhere to their teachings. Over the course of her career, Käthe Kollwitz did self-portrait after self-portrait, and she is in some ways inserting herself into the history of art, because artists like Rembrandt Rembrandt himself made a self-portrait nearly every year of his life, and Dürer did many self-portraits as well. So in the portrait over here, this is from 1924, and it's in woodcut, and this technique is extremely well adapted to depicting her middle-aged face with wrinkles forming, and this rather sort of stern gaze that she directs out to the world and to the viewer. Here, on the other hand, this is done in lithograph. And this is from 1938, so towards the end of her life. And here, the technique is adapted to what she's trying to express here, which is her aging body. It's not only her face, that she wishes to depict. It's her hunched shoulders, her aging face. All of these things are things that she wishes to get across. And if you look at the series of portraits from the earliest days up till 1938, this is her last one, then you see a fascinating view into the life of one artist. Now, the date of this portrait of 1938 is a significant one for the artists in this exhibition. By this date, many of them had emigrated, and that had to do often with their political views, which were not those of the reigning Nazi regime. And others, of course, immigrated because of their family origin, which was Jewish. And so by 1938, many of the artists in this exhibition are either in the United States, as Georg Gross and Max Beckmann are, or other places outside of German-speaking lands.